Okay, so we can start then. Well, welcome to this international seminar series, Democratization and Authoritarianism in the 21st Century. I am José Esteban Castro. I am Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Newcastle University, and I am a foreign visiting professor at Federal University of Pernambuco in Brazil, working in the postgraduate program of sociology and collaborating also with the Center for Advanced Studies at the university, where the seminar is being hosted. So, welcome everyone to this seminar, and I will pass now the word to Professor Gustavo Gómez da Costa, coordinator of our postgraduate program in sociology and fellow of the Center of Advanced Studies, to open up the seminar.
Thank you, Professor Esteban. So good morning for all those who are following the seminar here in the Americas, and good afternoon for those in Europe, Africa, and Asia. On behalf of the postgraduate program of sociology at the Federal University of Pernambuco, I would like to welcome you to the seminar today. But before we start our event, I would like to say a few words. First, I would like to congratulate Professors José Esteban Castro and Paulo Henrique Martins for the initiative to discuss those very important issues in current times, democratization and authoritarianism. These issues are particularly central in Brazil, where we experienced a recent attempt of coup d'etat, showing that, contrary to some famous theories in sociology and political science in the 80s and the 90s, democracy is far from consolidated, and it demands a constant and fierce struggle for its preservation. Second, I would like to highlight the central role of sociology to bring insights to understand our reality. As a science which has been engaged in understanding social relations, sociology cannot escape its role in providing answers to the challenges of our time. Third, I would like to emphasize that this seminar is part of an effort of internationalization of UFPE. As a university located in the northeast Brazil, UFPE is committed to producing high-level scientific research and providing insights to key issues, both nationally and internationally. And last but not least, I would like to thank Professor Goran, Eric, and Sari for accepting the invitation to take part in the debates today. I'm sure it will be a very productive and pleasant seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gustavo, for the introduction, and we have now, we can start the seminar. I think exactly how you say. This is important in Brazil, no doubt about that, but I will say that it's very important in Latin America as a whole, where we have experiencing this return of authoritarianism, and we have very fragile democracies. But it's also the case even in Europe or the US. So it's a global problem. And I think that today we will have that approach from a global perspective as well. No? So many thanks for that. And I want to introduce now Professor Paulo Henrique Martins, Professor of Sociology here in our postgraduate program and in the Department of Sociology. Professor
Good
Paulo
morning.
Henrique. Okay.
Good morning, Stephen. Good morning, people. As member of the postgraduate program of sociology and the Center for the Advanced Studies at the Federal University of Pernambuco, I would like to thank Stephen, who invited me to support him in organizing this debate on the implication of the relationship between democracy and authoritarianism today. Steven's idea of inviting Professor Taborn, Swingedown, and Anafi as a speaker also deserves our applause. I have already had the opportunity to attend lectures by Professor Terborn at the ISA and Professor Hanafi at the ISA, ALES, and other international congress. We have many friends in common. I don't know Professor Swingedown personally, but I am very curious to hear him at this seminar. As a sociologist, interested to hear the reflections of the speaker, to hear the reflections of the speaker at this seminar. I think that the course of events in recent years has undone the optimism that many people had about democratization of social process. Here in Latin America, for example, we had a lot of hope for the so-called left-wing government in the last 2 decades. There is great expectation that democratically elected government would be able to make progress with important structural reform. But instead of this desired democratization, we have seen historical events take other directions that have strengthened the authoritarian tendencies and put the process of democratization political power at risk. That's why I'm going to watch this event very carefully, as I think because I think we will have valuable information to help us reflect on the matter. I wish you all a good journey, and I will be very interested. Will be looking at you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pablo Enrique. So we are now going to start. I think it's, as you both say, Gustavo and yourself, this is a very important topic. Obviously, it's a global topic, as I said before. And we will start now with the first speaker, Professor Eric Swingedo, who is professor of geography at the University of Manchester. And so he's also a visiting professor at the University of Ghent in Belgium. Well, he's known in Latin America very well as a political ecologist with much work done on water issues, urban water political ecology, nature and society relations. But he also has another side complementary to that, or that grounds the other work on political ecology, which is his concern with democracy and authoritarianism. And he will be talking today about that. So welcome, Eric, with us. It's a pleasure to have you with us, so we'll listen.
Thank you very much, Esteban. Can you hear me all right? I will assume you can hear me.
Yes.
Good, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be here. I first of all would like to thank Esteban and his colleagues for the invitation to have me present my thoughts at this seminar. The title of my talk is The Dialectic of Democracy: Emancipation Redefined, Enjoyment, and Reversing the Fallacies of Illiberal Democracy. There are 4 key points that I would like to convey, and I think it's useful to make these points at the beginning. The first point I'd like to make in my talk is to consider the fundamental transformation of the substance and practice of emancipation over the past few decades. The signifier emancipation is an empty signifier, and its very content, its substance, has changed considerably in important ways, meaningful ways over the past few decades. Secondly, I'm going to discuss how the present dominant view of emancipation revolves around what Slavoj Žižek called the injunction to enjoy. And I would like to focus to a certain extent on enjoyment in the Lacanian sense of the word jouissance, enjoyment as a political factor, and how it relates to some of the current aspects of emancipation. Thirdly, I'm going to make the case that illiberal populism is not some sort of external intruder, but is in fact the flip side. It's internal to the very culture of neoliberal emancipation. I would argue that the particular substance of neoliberal emancipation and illiberal authoritarian populism are flip sides of the same process. And I will conclude by a call for, or by considering the need for politicizing or repoliticizing emancipation. The presentation I'm going to give is based on two papers that I've done recently for people who are interested in reading in greater detail what I'm trying to argue. Is a paper in South Atlantic Quarterly entitled The Perverse Lure of Autocratic Post-Democracy. And then 2 years ago in the European Journal of Social Theory, Illiberalism and the Democratic Paradox, the infernal dialectic of neoliberal emancipation. My talk is basically based on these two papers. Okay, the main thrust of this presentation unfolds around what I call the impasse or the deadlock of democratic politics today, characterized by what Appadurai calls the democratic fatigue syndrome and the fading belief of many in the presumably superior architecture of liberal democratic institutions to nurture emancipation on the one hand, and of course the seemingly inexorable rise of a variety of populist, illiberal, nativist, and or autocratic political parties and movements that seems to exercise an indelible lure for many, many people around the world on the other. The erosion of democratic life, I argue, unfolds through an infernal dialectic whereby the very drive for emancipation, understood under neoliberalization as the desire to become private and autonomous subject, and thus became unhinged from the rights and obligations of life in community, life in common. Nonetheless, the lure of choosing one's private identity that characterizes the drive for emancipation today, and which is also at the core of woke liberal leftism, unleashes, I would argue, the very mechanisms that undermines the democratic from within. And here then, for me, resides the present deadlock of democratic politics. That is, the neoliberal insistence on and the unfulfillable promise of individual freedom and emancipation as autonomy from the common, from the social bond, parallels and nurtures a growing sense among many of unease, anxiety, neurosis, failure, and an uncanny feeling of powerlessness that feeds a disdain for democracy itself. This nourishes the lure of autocratic and illiberal regimes as people desperately, but fail to, desperately try to regain an apparently impossible private enjoyment. This paradoxical deadlock operates within a particular historical unfolding of the dialectics of emancipation within a broadly neoliberal order. I maintain that the abstract notion of emancipation, understood as freedom from oppression and equality of expression, has been re-articulated over the past few decades in the formation of what I and others have called a neoliberal subject, and the associated metonymic requilting of emancipation understood as equality in the face of disembodied market forces, the immunological secularization of private life, and freedom expressed as the choice to consume and to be a manager or entrepreneur of the self. While Enlightenment notions of emancipation first unfolded under the mantra of autonomy and freedom from oppression and domination, and became enacted through emancipatory collective social and political struggle against oppressors, and later, principally under the impetus of the Frankfurt School, became scripted as a process of transgressing the repression and alienation of modern capitalist societies. The symbolization and practices of emancipation under neoliberalization, in contrast, revolve around the superego demand to enjoy, to maximize the fulfillment of private desire. So, as Slavoj Žižek and others have argued, the pursuit of enjoyment became a key political factor. The earlier Enlightenment notion of emancipation involved forms of both social and political struggle against a variety of forms of oppression, religious, class, sexual, and others, to achieve sovereignty of the individual under conditions of generalized equality and sustained by a common social bond. The culture of neoliberalization, in contrast, inaugurated a move of the process of emancipation from a collective, the process operating under the aegis of equality to a private and individualized affair. It should be here. Emancipation became an individual mission. This time, scripted not so much as liberation from oppression or transcending alienation, but as an injunction to enjoy. In other words, enjoyment became the prime measure of emancipation under neoliberalization, and failure to enjoy the sole responsibility of the individual. If you do not enjoy, it's your failure. It is this anxiety around achieving private enjoyment, something that actually always fails, that sustains, I would argue, the call for increasing autocratic and illiberal politics as the means to guarantee the fulfillment of the desire of the individual and the promise of enjoyment nurtured by private life. As Todd McGowan insists, it is precisely the attempt to and avoid the public that nourishes the totalitarian impulse that wipes out all privacy. Neoliberalization, in its autocratic populist guise, promises continuously to remove the obstacles for enjoyment, obstacles which are imagined to reside in the other, as the state, the common, the migrant, greenhouse gases, whatever that stands in the way of fulfilling private enjoyment. And thereby to safeguard the autonomy and the sovereignty of the individual in the face of all manner of risks and threats that challenge the drive for enjoyment. Neoliberalization becomes what Roberto Esposito calls an immuno-biopolitical governance regime. The lure of immunological illiberal regimes is indeed undeniable, as political parties that advocate such populist regime changes attract a growing crowd of voters. The success of autocratic populist parties is customarily, certainly by us, the liberal elites, interpreted as an external and irrational intrusion of the misguided masses that foolishly embrace post-truth discourses and ideologies that threaten, so we argue, to destabilize the unquestionable and assumedly self-evidently superior foundations of liberal democracy. However, I would like to argue that rather than considering illiberal populism as an alien body that infects and undermines the originally healthy body politic, I consider the present surge of illiberal autocracies as a symptom of the deadlock produced by the contradictions and antagonisms that constitute present-day instituted populist post-democracy in its articulation with the deepening process of cultural neoliberalization. The democratic invention, Claude Lefort demonstrates, is of course predicated upon a radical heterogeneity that cuts through the notion of the people. In contrast to the populist discourse, Lefort argues the people does not exist. As the constitutive divisions and conflicts that cut through the social cannot be erased, they are, as it were, ontological. Preserving then the phantasmic notion of a unified the people as one and whole requires of necessity an external element that can be posited as the object cause that undermines or destabilizes the illusionary oneness or unity of the people. Consider, for example, how Israel considers Hamas as this intruder, and the Palestinians consider the Israelis as that intruder. An imaginary and phantasmic displacement takes place, whereby a part of the community becomes scripted as a constitutive outsider that is the object cause of disruption, conflict, and theft of enjoyment. This phantasmic screen promises that the presumably lost unity of a unified and enjoying people can be reinstated through the erasure of the destabilizing intruder. The outsider becomes identified with the stumbling block for enjoyment. He or she steals our enjoyment and prevents the operation of the people as one and unified. This is precisely why illiberal populism necessarily relies on a fantasy screen that assigns the role of the malignant intruder who destabilizes the imaginary, the fantasy of a fully closed and harmonious social order. An immunological biopolitics underpins the consolidation of illiberal rule. Of course, anything or anyone can take the symbolic place of the intruder. Jews for the Nazis, Muslims or refugees for xenophobic populists in Europe, greenhouse gases for climate activists and green populism, the European Union for United Kingdom Brexiteers, etc. Both the lure of the neoliberal appeal and its subsequent transformation into more autocratic directions, or for me, the twin outcomes of the very mechanisms through which neoliberalization became instituted. What needs to be accounted for, therefore, is precisely why so many people from across the social and class spectrum, and who were so often enthralled, who were so often enthralled by neoliberalization's ideological promise of and support for autonomy, freedom, individuality, and privacy, so easily and freely succumbed to the populist autocratic temptation. Indeed, as Hannah Arendt insisted, nothing proved easier to destroy than the privacy and the private morality of people who thought of nothing but safeguarding their private lives. The early diplomacies and supporting imaginaries of neoliberalization provided for an apparently immunological prophylactic against the threat of an irredeemably interventionist nanny state, bureaucratic biopolitical control, economic straitjacketing, and enforced communal obligations, like the old welfare state. In the process, the erosion of the public sphere paralleled the desire for private autonomy sustained by the injunction to enjoy. Gradually, earlier societies of religious or sexual prohibition and class, gender, or racialized repression transformed into societies of individualized but ultimately inaccessible enjoyment, reaching its apogee in the neoliberal promises of consumer autonomy, identity politics, self-management, and private self-realization. The realization of private desire that defines present dominant forms of emancipation nonetheless required increasingly forceful political intervention to be sustained and nurtured. As Todd McGowan explains, in this sense, totalitarianism is not the reverse side of liberalism's insistence on sustaining the private world at all cost, but instead the ultimate endpoint of this insistence. The more one seeks to safeguard your privacy and clear the path for capitalist relations of production, the more one also leaves space for the rise of totalitarianism. Two sides of the same coin. So to begin to conclude, I would argue that the democratic requires reclaiming from the process of the contested and never fully complete dynamics, both promised by the fantasy of neoliberalization and by illiberal populism and associated new authoritarianisms. I'm not referring here to democracy as a set of political institutions like parliaments, governance, and the like. I'm not referring to institutional principles and its associated political procedures like free elections, etc. But rather, I'm referring to the founding gesture of the democratic. As Jacques Rancière insisted, the democratic political expresses the contingent and fully axiomatic presumption of equality. It's not something to be achieved, it's something that is presumed. This equality of each and everyone, qua speaking, and hence political beings. The injunction to enjoy that quilts neoliberal emancipatory discourses today and the recurrent failures of realizing this promise, failures that nurture illiberal populism, has to be transgressed by transcending the umbilical cord that knots emancipation to this unfulfillable promise of neoliberalization. This requires requilting emancipation from being vested in the promise of private enjoyment that is impossible to fulfill anyway, to an act of political subjectivation around the signifier equality. In other words, the autocratic law that I identified earlier is nothing else than a symptom of the repetitive failure to enjoy, caused by an other who is imagined to stand in the way of an ultimate yet impossible enjoyment. The recognition of this failure is constitutive to the subject, not external. And it's that recognition that opens potentially a terrain for recapturing both the democratic political and egalitarian emancipation. Traversing the neoliberal fantasy implies reframing enjoyment away from fulfilling a private desire and uninhibited autonomy to circling instead around the axiomatic democratic presumption of equality. Indeed, as Todd McGowan insists, democracy has always been a signifier replete with enjoyment, an indication of excess that no social structure can adequately contain. Yanis Stavrakakis also equates democracy or the democratic with enjoyment. And I quote, far from being antithetical to jouissance, to enjoyment, democratic subjectivity is capable of inspiring high passions. They mobilize a jouissance beyond accumulation, domination, and fantasy. In this presentation, we insisted on how the lure of autocratic post-democracy and post-democratic populism relied on the impossibility of enjoyment, while the culture of neoliberalization enjoins us to enjoy. It is this impasse that fuels part of the erosion of the democratic. Recapturing the transgressive enjoyment that resides potentially in the scandal of democracy, that is, an enjoyment not promised or policed by an external authority, but in the desire for enjoyment arising from the subject, opens up a terrain that associates emancipation not so much with good, as political scientists have customarily done, but with enjoyment. For Jacques Rancière, democracy or the democratic has always been associated with the terrain of excess. As he puts it in Hatred of Democracy, and I quote, as a social and political form of life, democracy is the reign of excess. This excess signifies the ruin of democratic government and must therefore be repressed by it. Or as McGowan continues, democracy is excessive because it strips away all legitimacy justifying social authority. It signifies the absence of legitimate social authority. In democracy, the people govern, but democracy entails the paradoxical recognition that the people as an entity does not exist. Democracy is thus an acceptance of a certain necessary illegitimacy and the enjoyment that accompanies it. This excessive acting is also the terrain upon which Jacques Rancière situates emancipation. For Rancière, emancipation is an act of verification of the axiomatic principle of equality, one that is always in part undermined by any given instituted order, democratic or otherwise. The latter implies not only checking the reality of the principle of equality in any given order, but more literally, the demonstration and the making of equality. That is the process through which the empty signifier of equality acquires symbolization and social substantiation. Thus, emancipation unfolds through acts of subjects who refuse to occupy and enact their allocated place within the given and instituted order. And in their acting, demonstrate the very inequality that is inscribed in that given order. Emancipatory acts articulated around equality are indeed excessive to the instituted and always partially inegalitarian order. Take, for example, the iconic moment, at least for the United States civil rights movement, when Rosa Parks, a trained black activist, sat down on a white designated seat on a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama on the 1st of December 1955. It was one of the iconic moments inaugurating the American civil rights movement. In doing so, she both demonstrated the wrong inscribed in the existing configuration and performatively demonstrated equality. Such acts, like the one I just exemplified, inaugurate the moment when one refuses to be an object of immunological biopolitical governance within a given distribution of functions. To do this, one becomes a political subject, claiming and performing equality. In other words, the axiomatic presumption of equality is the very premise upon which emancipatory acts are constituted. A democratizing and hence emancipatory political sequence arises when, in the name of equality, those who are not equally included in the existing order stage their right to equality. It's a performative acting that inaugurates politics, that renders visible what is invisible, hearable what is only registered as unarticulated noise, and exposes the wrongs in the present order. An emancipatory practice is not just one that includes the excluded, or worse, that asserts the identity of the dominated. Both tactics just reproduce the logic of inequality, but instead involves the transgression and hence the transformation of the existing. And by doing so, opening up a possible trajectory for the positive material realization of equality in the face of inegalitarian practices. And in doing so, strives for the universalization of this egalitarian injunction from the basis of always historically and geographically situated and locally specific inequalities. Such emancipatory practice is predicated on political subjectivation, the becoming of a political subject through grounded emancipatory struggles. This is why, and I conclude, Jacques Rancière equates emancipation with politics. The moment when the principle of equality meets the always inegalitarian inscriptions of the given order. Rescripting politics as emancipation might indeed permit transgressing the present deadlock marked by consensual neoliberalizing post-democracy, the pursuit of an impossible private enjoyment, and the rise of illiberal autocratic regimes. I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. I'm happy to answer any possible questions you might have, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Excellent. So let's see if there are any comments or questions. Otherwise, we can have our own. I think it's very pertinent while we wait for some questions from the public to say that this is, of course, very apposite for what we are living, as it was said at the beginning, here in Brazil, recovering, but still under the threat of a return of forms of authoritarianism that are very much in turn with what we've said. And now the experience in the neighboring country, Argentina, that is, of course, activating many of these issues in extreme ways, I would say, etc. So we can, it's even difficult to think about what emancipation may look like under these conditions and who could be really interested in emancipation in the way you put it.
Yeah.
Who is the subject of emancipation in this context?
Yes. That is actually the $1 million the question. And I do think that we might want to revisit the old sort of notion of political subjectivation that is inscribed in the social position people take. The proletarian becomes a proletarian because of the social position the worker takes within capitalist relations. Although that still holds, of course, to a certain extent, if we look at attempts at emancipated transformation today, I'm thinking of the Occupy movement, the Chilean movement in 1917, 1918, the Indignados, Taksim Square, etc. If we looked at moments like that had elements of emancipatory transformation in them, if we look at the composition or the participants, they were very wide-ranging in terms of their social inscription: men, women, workers, intellectuals, religious, non-religious, Christian, Muslim, etc. But what they shared in their heterogeneous social inscription was a desire for emancipatory transformation. So I think that interesting insights to be gained from attempts in recent years, although most of them failed. You have to think about that too. But attempts at transforming. I mean, Chile is a very good example, actually. Over the past few years, a quite successful one. They made it up to a reformulated constitution. That's quite an achievement. They failed the referendum. But it's one of the most successful ones in many ways, if you compare it with the Arab Spring or Taksim Square or the Indignados, who achieved very little other than a populist autocratic counter revolt in Turkey or Egypt.
Yeah, that's important. And I think in the future we will have some seminar of this seminar series trying to connect some comparative experiences like Chile with others, just to take the lessons that we can
Yeah, that
get
would be
out.
very interesting, yes, and very important. But because we do see all kinds of experimentations going on with new forms of emancipatory transformation and forms of organization associated with it. But I think we still have a long way to go. At the moment, there is not much hope on the horizon, I think.
Pablo Enrique, you want to make a question?
Very much.
And then Sari.
I like very much your exposition. I think it's very original and fine. I think this is very important to stress the changing of the emancipation idea nowadays. Then, in this direction, and the change of the subjectivation process too. Then, my question for you is if we are in this moment in to progress in a discussion of the affection emotion, to rethink rationality, emancipation from the new views about the relationship between subjectivation and the emotion and affection, to rethink rationality. What think about that?
Yeah. So, indeed, thank you very much for the question. It helps me to further explain what I was trying to argue. From a enlightenment perspective and from a modern social science, the political science perspective, the discussion as well as the practice of emancipation articulated around two axes. On the one hand, a consideration of social power. Emancipation has to do with the relations of power and transcending those. So the key axis is power, and that could be rationally understood by a Marxist or Foucauldian or whatever other perspective. Or the second axis around which emancipation was argued around in practice was that it constituted a public good, kind of public good versus a public bad. So these were the two axes. They mattered. But I think what has been radically ignored and is often relegated to the domain of the irrational is what I call enjoyment, the articulation of the desire. And I don't think we have been very good at articulating the centrality of desire, enjoyment as a political factor. And that is what I try to insist on here, that A, we really have to take more seriously this question of enjoyment. And I use a very particular notion of enjoyment, that is the one that is articulated to psychoanalytic perspectives. A, we have to take that more seriously. B, we have to take that more seriously because the neoliberal promise of emancipation resides exactly around nurturing private enjoyment. This is the success of the discourse or the culture of neoliberalization. Do enjoy yourself. You can. We will assure your enjoyment, and that was so immensely effective, and was very performative, actually, by galvanizing the support of the disempowered, the marginalized, etc., that bought into this promise of neoliberalism. The neoliberal ideology, is the condition for the realization of your private desire and pleasure. Of course, that could not be achieved. Hence the increasing call for illiberal regimes to take away the obstacles that stand in the way of fulfilling enjoyment. That's why we can see in almost any illiberal discourse and practice the staging of an external, assumedly external intruder that is the threat to my enjoyment. Yeah, whether it's the international capitalist elite or the Muslim or the Jew or whatever else. So both of those examples, that is the injunction to enjoyment sustained by the neoliberal discourse and practice, as well as the illiberal one, are structured by this thing of enjoyment. And that is something that I think we social theorists, as well as political strategists have not sufficiently taken into consideration at all cost, in a nutshell.
Thank you. Sari?
Yes, thank you so much, Eric. I think I would like to try to connect your thought on enjoyment with the work of Eva Illouz on emotional capitalism, and to see where it diverge and converge. Uh, um, uh, Eva Illouz's work on commodification of emotion and the intrusion of capitalism in the private spheres. I mean, um, so this emotional uncertainty in the realm of love, romance, and sex is the direct sociological effect in the way in which the consumer market, therapeutical industry, and the technology of the internet have been assembled and embedded by the ideology of individual choice that has become the main cultural framework organizing personal freedom.
Yeah.
And the whole issue now is in fact that people some theorize cultural legitimization of sexual choice as its emotional and hedonistic ground, but in fact is not really more and more. It's not up to the individual. There is structure of feeling, what Williams would say. It means that social media is so much impacting our enjoyment, our emotion, and things like that. I'm working on gender issues and on gender fluidity as a metaphysical concept, and how much the neoliberalism is introduce it as so much self-evidence things of social change, which is really behind it. We realize pharmaceutical industry and many things that is not simply a personal choice. So, can you, Eric, react to my comment? I mean,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. I do not know the authors that you used, but I follow your argumentation and your summary, and I very much agree with you or with these authors that neoliberal capitalism is an extraordinary libidinal machine. Yeah, it promises continuously the satisfaction of your most intimate desires, whether it's sexual or otherwise, doesn't matter. You can be whoever you want to be. In fact, identity politics, gender politics, very much feeds on this continuous promise that we neoliberal culture can fulfill any kind of private individual desire one might have, and it's your obligation to actually fulfill that. So capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, in contrast to 20th century capitalism or 19th century capitalism, was very much based on sacrifice. We were taught to sacrifice. That's gone, of course. Now it's excessive. Consuming identity, not just the commodities, but identities and kind of sexual arguments or gender arguments are very good illustrations of that. You can have what kind of excessive desire that you want, and neoliberalism will deliver that. So one has to recognize how capitalism is extremely successful as a libidinal machine. However, well, I wanted to push it further, I think, in my presentation, following people like Mago and Zizek and others, is that neoliberalism always fails. Yeah, that the satisfaction of desire is impossible. Is impossible. Of course, the very success and continuation, the reproduction of capitalism is predicated upon frustrating the desire all the time. There's always the next one. But instead of, that's what many people do. They become objects of neoliberalism. They start blaming someone else or something else for their incapacity or failure to fully enjoy. Yeah? And that is what has to be realized, I think. That's what the psychoanalytic insight brings to the open, is the impossibility of fully enjoying something. One has to accept that full enjoyment that neoliberalism promises is ontologically impossible. And I see that as a possible opening to cut through the antinomies of this extraordinary and extraordinarily successful, the libidinal, the machine that capitalism is today. And it is like that everywhere, in Latin America, even in Africa, certainly Asia, and certainly in Europe and North America. That's where I would put it. So yes, it's about enjoyment, but it's not possible. And this contradiction has to be so grounded. Because it's precisely in the impossibility of fully enjoying that people begin to seek for a villain, an enemy, someone who is stealing enjoyment, and that can take a variety of forms. That's why we see so much populist xenophobia arising. If it were not for the Muslims in the United Kingdom or Germany, we would be all happy. That is a sort of classic right-wing argument, which feeds very successfully on this ontological incapacity for full enjoyment, that neoliberalism nonetheless continuously says, yes, you can do it. That would be my response.
Very good. Thank you very much. And I think we have more questions probably collecting from the public, but we will have that at the end of the seminar, or at the end of the last presentation. No? But this has been a very good round of first questions and comments. Thank you very much. So we will now move to the second presentation that will be by Professor Goran Fairborn, who is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Cambridge University, the United Kingdom, and is also an affiliated professor of sociology at Linnaeus University in Sweden. So he will be talking about issues of power. His main topic for many years. We know him very well. So the question of power and democracy, and some of his publications, like the others as well, Eric and Sari, will be circulated in YouTube and through other means later on. But we welcome Professor Thornborn, and you have the word. Thank you for being with us.
Can you hear me? You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fine. I can't see you. I mean, I'm still on, kept on backstage, but if you can hear me, then we can go on. I mean, this is a bit of a strange experience, but anyway, can you see me? No.
Both.
Okay, well, this seminar will have a wide. Wait a minute. This seminar certainly has a wide range from starting with enjoyment, and now comes a horror story, and we'll see what will be the third theme. So congratulations, Stefan, for bringing together this range of topics. Now I'm going to talk about the democracy in this century, and I would characterize it as de-democratization, and I will talk about genocidal democracy and other post-liberal developments. The 20th century saw the victory of democracy, although more as an ideal than a reality, but nevertheless a major advance in popular rights and powers. Our century has started with processes of de-democratization and with a widespread disenchantment, right and left, with actually existing democracies. Most of the world-inspiring Arab Spring was defeated, and the Latin indignados claiming real democracy, now in English, ended up with nothing or less. In Euro-American liberal and social democratic discourse, threats and attacks on democracy are above all coming from so-called right-wing populism, more concretely from xenophobic and culturally conservative currents with an iconoclastic popular appeal. From a progressive enlightenment perspective, these currents are certainly unpleasant, but equally certainly they have not mounted an attack on democracy, as a former Swedish Prime Minister Ingvar Carlsson recently suggested. None of the significant xenophobic parties have campaigned for or planned for replacing multi-party electoral democracy with something else. And we can take the explicit fascist heiress Giorgia Meloni, current Italian Prime Minister, who has turned out a true Thatcherite and not the successor of Mussolini. Governmental influence on the judiciary and on the media, main targets of criticism against the right-wing regimes of Hungary and until recently Poland, have their functional equivalents in other democracies, for instance in Spain and the US. The view of popular rights on sexual and gender rights was standard Western democracy value before 1970. And the negation of immigration has now been adopted by social democrats and most liberals. So I think the northern liberal social democratic reaction to the current situation of democracy is like wolf and viper. which in the north, like tropical snakes, are not seriously dangerous. The 20th century drew some epochal humanitarian conclusions from the horrors of the century. Most importantly, the UN Genocide Convention of 1948 and the UN Declaration of Human Rights of 1949. According to the current Secretary General of Amnesty, Agnes Kalamar, that era, which led up to the fall of apartheid of the Berlin Wall, quote, is as good as gone, unquote. And in its recent report, the organization Amnesty concludes powerful governments cast humanity into an era devoid of effective international rule of law, with civilians in conflict paying the highest price, unquote. The dramatic change of political culture of the world from the mid-20th century to current times is highlighted by the full public display condoning and support of genocidal democracy. What is happening in Gaza for more than 7 months by now is clearly genocide according to the UN Genocide Convention. That is, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, unquote. The intent was explicit from the top and relayed to field officers and soldiers. At least twice, addressing his soldiers, Prime Minister Netanyahu asserted, quote, you must remember what Amalek have done to you, says our Holy Bible, unquote. His Bible reference was to God's admonition to the people of Israel, quote, now go attack Amalek, who was an ancient people. Spare no, but kill alike men and women, infants and sucklings. And he goes on to kill their animals as well. The quote is from the first book of Samuel, chapter 15, verse 3. President Herzog declared, quote, it is an entire nation out there that is responsible. It is not true, this rhetoric about civilians, and we will fight until we break their backbone, unquote. The Minister of Defense, General Gallant, quote, Gaza won't return to what it was before. We shall destroy everything, unquote. The Israeli genocide in Gaza is democratic in a double sense. It is decided by a democratically elected government, and it is supported by the Jewish people of Israel. Late October polls showed that 57% of Israeli Jews thought that too little firepower was used in Gaza, while 37 considered it roughly enough. A poll in late December asked about the US so-called demand for, quote, reducing the heavy bombardment of densely populated areas, unquote. 75% of Israeli Jews rejected that. And as a kind of sign of exclamation, I don't know why, is the Jerusalem Post published a quote from a local council head in Israel, quote, Israel should make Gaza look like Auschwitz, unquote. The Gaza genocide is not just a local aberration by a small West Asian state. It is an act legitimized, supported, and protected by the world's richest and most powerful democracies, headed by the United States and Germany, who are both supplying Israel, the Israeli army, with weapons and ammunition. They don't share the genocidal intent of the Israelis and can even say quote, too many civilians are killed, unquote. However, they and most other Western democracies turned a blind eye to the ongoing genocide out of geopolitical interest and cultural and democratic affinity with Israel. The Western states' legitimation, or at least tolerance of genocide, and their indifference to the mass suffering and death of non-Western population has produced a remarkable disconnection between the democratic political elite of Western countries and large parts of their people who are now come out against the genocidal acts. With their cultural indifference and or cold geopolitical calculations, the governing politicians of the US and the EU have isolated themselves not only from popular opinion, but also to a large extent from the judicial and the cultural elite of their region, and very remarkably from the humanitarian institutions and organizations of the world, the United Nations and its own aid organizations, Amnesty, and Human Rights Watch. All the Western judges on the genocide panel of the International Court of Justice last January voted against Israel, finding that Israeli genocidal acts are plausible. How deep, wide, and enduring the abyss opened between the Western political elite and the people of their countries is uncertain. More certain is that it will accelerate the political decline of the US EU bloc in the world and of their kind of, quote, rule bound international order, unquote. The US and the EU have a long list of countries and individuals targeted so called sanctions, but not against Israel, nor any Israeli politician or military leader. Adding insult to injury, in front of the approaching famine in Gaza, the US and the EU suspended funding for the UN humanitarian organization UNRWA immediately upon unfounded Israeli allegations of Hamas infiltration. Against rumors that the International Criminal Court might indict the Israeli leadership for its atrocities, the US Congress has swung into action. One action was a late April mafia style letter of intimidation to the court, concluding, quote, target Israel and we will target you with severe sanctions against you and your institution, unquote. It was initiated by Senator Tom Cotton and was signed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives and the Republican minority leader in the Senate, among others, and is supported also by some Democrats. There is, by the way, already a bill of sanctions against ICC judges and prosecutors registered in the Senate. Sanctions against, in case any of them should make an intervention against the US and its allies, unquote. The enormity of the legitimation or the condoning of genocide of democracy by almost all the Western democracies overshadowed all other recent problems of actually existing democracies. But the letter deserves analytical attention too. And in its extensive assessment of the level of democracy in the world, the Swedish but multinationally staffed VDEM Institute has recently concluded that, quote, the level of democracy enjoyed by the average person in the world in 2023 is down to 1985 levels. According to its calculation, unquote, according to its calculation, 71% of the world population live in autocracies. The decline, quote, the decline is stark in Eastern Europe and South and Central Asia, unquote. And quote again, Western Europe and North America have equally been on a slow but steady decline in the level of democracy since 2010. After the mid or late 20th century democratic and human rights victories and the expansion, expectations and hopes that generated a widespread backlash, disenchantment and malaise set in. These have emerged and grown in three streams, becoming a flood tending to overwhelm liberal democracies, namely domestic social relations, general cultural relations, and international power relations. The flooding has usually been triggered by new right-wing political entrepreneurs opening dams of social tension and resentment. In the broad brush picture, the domestic basis of democratic regress is neoliberalism in two ways: as an intentional causal force and in the consequences of its power. The political program of neoliberalism was de-democratization, though only by exception, as in Chile, abolition of democracy. It was set out first in the Trilateral Commission's 1975 book, The Crisis of Democracy. And the argument was that with popular participation and advances of the 1960s, democracy had become overloaded. Government institutions needed to be more insulated from the people. The budget should be revised, should be reined in by long-term expenditure caps, resilient to electoral outcomes. Central banks should be independent of democracy, etc. In short, governments should not be for the people and certainly not by the people. A US political investigation of US government policies from 1981 to 2001 corroborated this. When income groups had different policy preferences, the policies preferred by the poorest 70% of the people did not count at all. This study has been replicated in several countries in Europe with similar, although not quite so dramatic, results. Economically, the victory of neoliberalism from around 1980 meant that the northern post-World War II and the southern post-colonial equalization was wiped out. The economic growth benefited mainly the top 10 or top 1%. And at this point, with this development, it was crucial that neoliberalism also conquered social democracies and other center or center-left parties, like the US Democrats and the Indian Congress, for instance. The neoliberal social abandonment of the losers of globalization and immigration offered a resentful popular base for a new type of right-wing political entrepreneurs of an authoritarian bent. In a nutshell, this is the European and North American story. The most impactful of the process was the Wild West variant of neoliberal capitalism imposed on Russia in the 1990s. under Western guidance. It lowered the life expectancy of Russian males by 7 years, in a period of 7 years. And it brought down the difference in per capita income between Russia and Western Europe down to the levels of 1900, before the Russian Revolution. The 1960s and 1970s were also times of profound cultural change, of youth culture, of sex and gender norms and practices, secularization. It was spearheaded in the north, but emerging also in the south. It was followed by a rather powerful cultural backlash, most significantly and least expected by a desecularization driven by the rise of militant religious fundamentalism of all major religions, of Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism. As bearers of a divine truth, religious fundamentalists are a very polarizing political force, beyond democratic debate and compromise. Decline of democracy in India and in South Asia generally is largely due to the rise of militant religious fundamentalism and its connecting or linking up with social inequality and tensions. Hinduism in India, Islam in Pakistan, Buddhism in Sri Lanka, and entrenched ruling secularism in Bangladesh. The change of the media landscape from central mass communication to dispersed social media has often had a paradoxical effect of strengthening the authoritarian right, not only in USA, Brazil, and Argentina. Language on social media is often raw, emotional, and unreflective, and thereby with a strong polarizing effect. This could, of course, work in different directions, including in radical democratic as well as in radical authoritarian. De facto, however, in Europe and in the Americas, the social media have mainly boosted the authoritarian right, whereas they have mainly been democratic outlets to the Arab Spring and to recent democratic movements in Thailand and Myanmar. Finally, there is the change in international relations from globalization to imperial geopolitics. Settler colonialism harbored inherent genocidal tendencies, as the history of North American Indians and Australian Aborigines under settler colonialism shows. The settlers want to cleanse the conquered land of the indigenous population. This tendency tends to be stronger the more equal and democratic the settlers are, more bent on establishing an ethnic community than on exploiting the labor of the conquered. Exactly at the beginning of historical decolonization, Zionists, after an invitation by the British Empire, created the last settler colony in Palestine. At the time, it seemed like a convenient imperial solution to the problem of European anti-Semitism, exporting it out of Europe. In fact, it left a poison chalice of political conflict to the post-war international order. The North Atlantic experience of settler colonialism explains perhaps, at least in part, the US, German, British, and French support of tolerance for the ongoing Gaza genocide, and also the official support of these countries. and also the critical position of Ireland, on the contrary, which was Britain's first settler colony. Post-colonial states were generally ill-prepared for democracy. Their main legacy was imperial domination and a unified anti-imperialist movement, neither a school of political pluralism. But the new independent states also faced and are still facing an asymmetric world economy, of which they are still not only the poorest market, but moreover the one most volatile, most exposed to the volatility of markets, and recently to the violence of climate change. These external uncontrollable crises are shaking southern economies and societies out of democratic stability. Neoliberal unequalization, imposed so-called structural adjustment, and financial crashes add to the problems of southern democracy. Capitalist globalization has now been relegated to a low division of world games. When China in the mid-2010s seemed to be outcompeting the United States in the globalization game, the US changed not just the rules, but the game itself. The game is no longer free trade and capturing world markets, free capital movements, and recruiting most of it. No, it's imperial geopolitics with the priority goals of national interests, national security, and national power. Trade and capital flows have to be governed by national power interests, including tariffs and bans. The geopolitical turn is a significant force hollowing out democracy in the North, restricting permissible public discourse and normalizing xenophobia, paranoia, and militarization. To conclude, the 21st century is on a course of de-democratization. It is a regression in relation to the second half of the 20th century, reversing the advances of democracy, of human rights, and of equality. The support and protection of the Israeli genocidal democracy implied a colossal devaluation of democracy and indicate the dark direction of democracy in the future. The world game of imperial geopolitics, relaunched by the US, is ultimately about military power and war. In contrast to the era of fascism, current elites of liberal democracy have become attracted to war, opposing peace in Ukraine before Russia is defeated, opposing ceasefire in Gaza as long as they dared, and daydreaming of more coming new wars with Russia and China. In these states of war and preparation for more wars, the space for popular democracy and human rights is likely to continue to shrink. However, the US-EU bloc is declining politically and socioeconomically, and its militarization and war making are unlikely to bring any durable rewards. So to conclude, I think another world remains possible. Thank you.
Many thanks, Professor Fairborn. And many thanks also for keeping to the time, as the previous speaker as well. So we will have now a moment for questions, and then we can have more questions at the end. But I wanted to just say the importance of your bringing in this question of geopolitical imperialism or imperialistic geopolitics as being a kind of framework to what we are discussing today. No, it's part of it, and at the same time, it's a kind of framework. We have to keep that in mind. And I think the question of what is happening in Gaza is central for all our countries as well. It's a global issue, and certainly is creating tensions in democracies all over the place, dividing countries in their positions, leading to crazy positions, really, in this sense. So you brought many questions, many issues, very, very important. The process of democratization, I think, is a very important one that has been going on for decades. And the cultural backlash with the emergence of the fundamentalism in different regions, I think is a very important point to bring in as well. But I would like to see if there are other comments or questions. And Sari.
Hello, Goran. I'm so glad to see you after so many years. Last time it was in Beirut when Esteban was there as well.
I remember that very well. Yes.
Yeah. So, Goran, thank you so much to bring the question of the genocide on Gaza and how it has been denied, the culture of denial in Euro-American political mainstream mainstream politics. And in fact, when you started your talk, you show us this moving toward the right from many countries, like in Italy, like in Hungary and others, in Norway, and so on. But then now this imperialist tendency is a sort of convergence between the left and the right. And of course there is exception. We are talking in Brazil, with Lula was the champion of really raising this question of colonialism and social justice for the Palestinians. But what intrigued me, and this is what would be my talk after you, is to show that there is a problem with the discourse of the left and concerning the global social justice. I mean, when genocide is not applied to their backyard in Europe, for instance, the case of Bosnia, but in a place like in Palestine, Israel. Yeah. So I would like to have your comment on this.
Yes. Well, the ongoing wars, I mean, have shown both convergences and new divides. It's noteworthy, for instance, that among the Western political elite, there are two. Well, there's one prime minister and one future coming prime minister waiting, supporting the genociding process. One comes from left of center and the other from right of center. There is, on one hand, Macron's prime minister, who was completely bought the poison conveyor message from Netanyahu, his tendency. Who can anyone, I mean, give any moral lessons to Israel? And who can anyone say that Israel has overreacted by bombing? And the other figure is Keir Starmer, becoming Prime Minister of Britain, who originally was a human rights lawyer, who initially after the Hamas attack was asked whether thought what he thought of General Galland's decision to strangle Gaza by not allowing any food, any fuel, any electricity, any water into Gaza. Keir Starmer was asked, do you think Israel has a right to do that? And his coming Prime Minister and former human rights lawyer, Keith Council, answered, yes, I think so. Now, that was an unsustainable political position, even in Britain. But it is one indication, I mean, of how new these wars, also the Ukraine war, created, I mean, both new alliances and new divides. And I think this is what we should expect, and from this new geopolitics, including the fragility of these alliances and convergences. Because in geopolitics, I mean, you don't have a permanent friend, except Israel, perhaps, I mean, for the United States. You only have interests, permanent interests. And this, of course, makes the global political landscape a very dangerous one. Sort of, I mean, with increasing the risk of new wars, armed conflict.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Paulo Enrique.
Thank you, Professor Gordon, for your conference. And I have a small question. I'd like to ask you to deepen your position about the contradictions and connections between class inequality and race domination to advance democratic process. What do you suggest are ways of overcoming this split between class and race in favor of new kinds of solidarity and common life? How do you see the possibilities of overcoming the tension between racism and mercantilist power in favor of democratization when racial conflicts prevent negotiation process between social groups and countries? How can democratic regimes be organized when racial conflicts prevent negotiation process between social groups? Also in a context where the major economic powers, particularly US, prefer to invest in the production of war rather than the production of peace between nations.
I'm not quite sure I follow your your question completely, but it's certainly true. I mean that national and ethnic and if you want racial divides of a nation, I mean, creates often difficult divisions and polarization within democracies. Um, we saw that rather dramatically in a supposedly stable Western European democracy in Spain a couple of years ago, and the enormous nationalist and imperial polarization which was thrown up between los españolistas and the Catalan independentistas. And it's also so that we know that ethnic relations and ethnic divides hardly ever disappear. They become latent, then sometimes for good reasons there is a compromise, there is a settlement, but then sooner or later some new issues appear and there is a new divide. And that is a constant problem of heterogeneous democracies. On the other hand, I think we should also notice the interesting de-ethnification of well, not de-ethnification, rather the 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 multi-ethnic character of, for instance, Western European politics. When Rishi Sunak, an Indian banker, was elected leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister, he was competing with 3 or 4 others, none of which was born in the United Kingdom, and none of which was white. And that was a Conservative Party. So in that sense, there is also some positive perspectives of overcoming narrow identity politics. This may not, I mean, have quite answered what you wanted to know. So if there is something important I missed, kind of bad hearing, please tell me, and I try to better myself.
Oh, well, I put this question because in Latin American, it's a problem to build democracy regimes when there are some conflict between class, interesting, and racism and ethnical position and conflict. Then, from this question, the regional problem of building democracy, I thought that you could offer some other ideas about European process and global process.
Yeah, well, we know from the history of democracy and so on that the rights and the citizenship and the full recognition of ethnic minorities or racial groups or whatever they are called have always been more complicated than class issues. Although on the other hand, I mean the outcomes of the decisive outcomes of democracy have depended on class relations of power, I think.
Hi, أهلا. Ready for tomorrow?
Okay.
Very ready.
So I think very good. We can come back to comments or questions at the very end. At the very end.
Rina,
I just wanted to say before going to the third speaker that the question is in both presentations, Eric and Goran's, there is something at the end in different ways, in different language, that conveys the message. I think Goran said that another world is possible, another future is possible. I think there is a message, a positive message at the end, without romanticizing, of course. Both had very critical presentations. But at least the message at the end, as there is light at the end of the tunnel, as we say, no? There is some
Good luck. It's a
different
very
ways.
beautiful project.
So we can come back to that at some point. But first, I think we need to go to the third presentation by Sari Hanafi. Sari Hanafi is professor of sociology at the at the American University of Beirut. So all the publications by all the three speakers will be put in YouTube. So I don't mention here any of those. But Sari Hanafi was the president of the International Sociological Association as well between 2018 and 2023. He's a member, a fellow of the British Academy, and he will be speaking now about similar topics, of course. So, Sari, I give you the word, please.
Thank you so much, Esteban. I went quickly to bring some coffee. Look, I thinking a lot about your topic, about if you like your seminar, and I choose to take an angle to show how now it's problematic how democracy, liberal democracy, end up into societal polarization and attack on academic freedom. So what I call in the current time of the symbolic liberalism, I will explain this. So if you like, if we look now about last quarter of century, we notice what I call it a time of late modernity, but we can call it other things, that how authoritarianism is spreading more and more on the south, but not only, and populism in the north, but not only, and people move to the right. I mean, every few months I should update this map showing how the blue color is going more and more, the world going into this black color and blue color, especially not the light one. And if we take, if you like, the major liberal democracy in Europe, and I rely in the work of Eric Grindheim, recent work looking to the last 4 elections, and notice that all the countries in in Western Europe, the part of the populist right, so not only the right, populist right, is going up, except Norway. And actually, after the publication of his work, I mean, Norway also, the populist right there went up. So, and then, of course, specifically, we should highlight the increase in inequality, precarity, and exclusion, vulnerability among the growing middle class, more violence in society. So this is, again, some of the pathologies of late modernity, but also about more hierarchical polarization of society. And this is where really I would like to stop. I mean, we find it in cultural sphere, but in fact, it's crossing all the spheres, this polarization. So I will talk about this polarization and put particularly my case study about the debates on academic freedom and the intolerance in the American academic field, then the French field, and then I will go to the academic freedom under the fire as Gaza burn. And thank you, Goran, for talking about the genocidal case on Gaza, that this facilitate my talk. So if you like, if we look to the for instance, Trump election in 2022, in Turkey 2023, the political failure of Arab Spring, all these are a moment where we see how much society has been polarized. And I would argue that that the bulk of response of the social science and or sociology to the pathologies of late modernity was defined as being classically liberal, but politically illiberal. And this is what I label symbolic liberalism. For I will go so fast on this concept, but please refer to my paper published in International Sociology last year under the title Toward Dialogical Sociology. So what? So if you like, what I argue that what the meaning they are politically liberal, I mean that while they agree that there is it's important society reach a unified conception of the of social justice, what is a justice, but they don't allow plurality of the conception of the good. And if we remember political liberalism of Jean Rawls, but not only Jean Rawls, I mean, but Jean Rawls was really the most eloquent in delineate this concept. I mean, the difference between conception of justice and conception of the good, that society, individual and community can have a different conception of the good, and then this should be debated within the society in order to reach a sort of modus operandi how to deal with this conflict. What I argue that there is that contrary to many talk who say the problem is with the right, my contribution to say, look, let us look to us as a left to see whether we have problem, and I identify problem as imposing a hegemonic conception of the good. And this can be seen with the very hardline French neo-secularism imposing on migrant, on marginalized people, the way that women should be dressed, banning veil in schools and in public office. We can see it by imposing a deculturalized mode of sexuality, that now we should all go into gender fluidity, where sexuality is fluid, ephemeral, and so on, and package all this as a conception of justice, while it is part of the conception of the good. So this is, if you like, a nutshell how I describe this symbolic liberal trend. We find it, and of course this you cannot understand how they become hegemonic without understand how our capitalism become so neoliberal and emotional. And I think the presentation of Eric was extremely useful to understand the context. So, so when it comes to the hierarchical polarization, we talk in many liberal democratic countries about war of cultures, cultural backlash, politics of outrage. If I refer to the work of Mark Freeman, argue that while the problem of polarization is nowhere on par with civil society, civil war, authoritarianism, genocide, it can, if ignored, become more harbinger of and accelerant of the problem. So, so we qualify this polarization by different words: affective, ideological, symmetric, asymmetric, political, social, religious, etc., etc. So it is for me a hyper problem, the type of problem that make the solution to every other problem harder. So if you like, if I move from this polarization that you find it not only in academia, not only harbored by social science, but sciences, but also in the media, in many sectors, in schools, etc. But I will focus, if I go to the media, to academia particularly, I would say that we have now real problem called cancel culture. And let me take the Harvard letters, open letters signed by 400 scholar, where how they defined this: an intolerant of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and a tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in the blinding moral certainty. So, so if you like, these letters, by the way, is not signed only by right-wing people, but by left, somebody like Noam Chomsky, Martin Amis, Salman Rushdie, Margaret Atwood, etc. So, I don't use it like the right wing talking only the left is doing cancel culture, but effectively it's a serious one. And we have a data about that, and not only some observation. If you look to the Germany recently, how they sacked two outstanding professors like Ghassan Al-Haj from Max Planck Institute, or Nancy Fraser, supposed to be a visiting professor in Germany. But we have even figures. So if I take the Award of Political Science survey in 2019, the reply to the cancel culture index, if I quote the work of Biba Norris, reflects the experience of a growing restrictions on academic freedom of speech, pressures for ideological conformity, and the enforcement of political correct speech. The result confirmed the significant effect of left-right ideology, which consistently predict scores on this index. So, so if you like, this phenomenon has a structural aspect, and the structural aspect is the commodification of higher education and the intrusion of a neoliberalism to our campuses. The spread of the culture of safetyism among administrators has resulted in their delivery of hasty decisions and disproportionate punishments against some professors, sometimes for a simple quoting of the work of literature in classes, and for not giving advance warning to students, trigger warning, what we call, all in the spirit of panicked damage control. So, now looking to the debate on the academic freedom, I think the most important factors play against the academic freedom is the autonomy of higher education institution. And historically, we say in the global north, you have the donors and the business and the tycoon who impose their agenda. But in the global south, we have the authoritarian countries who subsidize our national universities and help us to criticize the government. But in fact, the picture is much more complex when different traditions, Humboldtian, Napoleonian, and managerial blend. And the question which really become important is what type of elite polarization you find in society and what type of the political regime. That explains so much the academic freedom. And I think the work of Dina Kiwan in her last book that I endorse it is a fantastic book about academic freedom and the transnational production of knowledge, showing that now the problem is not only the censorship from your university, but if you write specific things, you will not be able to publish in international journal. Yeah. So let me quickly move to case studies. So I have 3 case studies. One about American academic field. If we take the statistic from Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, show us in 2020, you have around 150 professors were targeted for their speech against only 30 in 2015. So they got warning, investigation, suspension, termination. And why? Because of partisanship, their attitude about gender, institutional policy, and so on. And even I looked for another statistic from another association, and I found really you have it dismissal and termination of contract in 2020, 65 against only 4 cases in 2015. So you see how the growth of this intolerance of debate is going so exponentially, if you like. So again, I don't have time to go in details, but we have evidence that more and more this popular even among students. For instance, 80% of PhD students are willing in US campuses to discriminate against a scholar holding minority perspective. Okay, and other things. So I look to particularly to the case of the disinvitation incidents, what in UK they call no platforming. It means that banning somebody because of his or her opinion to talk. So so you see that you find it in all type of university, public, religious, or secular in the United States. So you have almost 574 attempt of this, or a successful attempt of disinviting someone who's supposed to talk. And and it's very interesting that the 2/3 come from the left of the speaker. It means that the left is more tendency to do this than in the right, but actually in both sides there is. So, and again, we see that disinvitation incidence is growing through times very clearly. Let me qualify really, we need absolutely an ethical qualification of these incidents, because even today, our campuses are burning, are boiling actually in US, in actually in many Euro-American universities, and it's a real social movement for social cause. So, if you like, just to complete the work I did using some statistics, that I was interested in disinvitation because somebody wanted to present a Palestinian point of view in the American campus in the last 5 years. It's before Gaza. And I found four professors tell me that they were unable to invite, even when they invite another Israeli and Palestinian, but the provost or the chair, they don't want. And these 4 cases, they are not in the database of FIRE. It means that we have more cases of disinvitation, but it doesn't reach the public to be recorded. So and always there is this in the letters say this kind of talk will upset the sensitivity of some students, without mentioning who those students were nor seeing anything about many others whose feeling were not heard. I mean, most probably the majority. So I don't consider systematically disruption talk as a necessary and ethical. Denouncing politicians who have a long career in supporting wars can be justifiable. Universities should remain a site of protest, open discussion, and disagreement about politics of hegemonic authorities, as it was from the Vietnam War to apartheid South Africa. However, many other examples I saw are rather fit into the definition of cancel culture. Let me give you one example. This has come from my university. Last year, a colleague in philosophy invited Holly Lawful Smith, a philosopher from Melbourne University, who wrote a book published by Oxford University Press entitled Gender Critical Feminism. And this is just showing that some of the claim demand for rights of trans may enter into conflict with LGBTQ. I mean, lesbian, gay, etc. And it's very interesting that some students and faculty they went to that Title IX in order to stop to disinvite this scholar. It was online, the invitation even. It's not in. And it's very interesting that the Title IX they refused because they asked them to justify, and they didn't show how Lawford Smith actually against transphobe. But it's very interesting how it was formulated that trans rights are human rights. No one should ever have to debate even the validity of their existence. And actually, the book is absolutely not transphobe. It's just problematize some of the claim. So this is this kind of question really is a very important to show that there is really problem in our campus to deal with issues become taboo in our campus. Again, quickly, in the French debate, it's a very interesting. We all know how important post-colonial, decolonial scholarship, and you have a collective of 76 professors. Some of them, like Nathalie Naik, is a student of Pierre Bourdieu. I mean, she found an observatory for decolonialism against pseudoscience, and last year they organized a international conference entitled "After the Deconstruction: Reconstructing the Science and the Culture." It was inaugurated by the Minister of Education, just to show you, Jean-Michel Blanquet, how important this conference and for denouncing all post-colonialism and decolonial. And it's a very interesting. I looked to all those who participate in this workshop, and I found them just 3 weeks before starting of the workshop. They denounced Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and any scholar who dare to use the word apartheid, criticizing Israel and arguing that the use stigmatize Israel as apartheid state is an anti-Semitic things. So just to show you that, in fact, those who denounce the culture, the cancel culture, they practice it for another topics, if you like. Now I come to my third case studies, and again, as I said, it's a very interesting. Since 7 October, we see how the attack in academic freedom, sacking faculty, arresting students. And actually, it's a very interesting when you look closely. The divide is north-south about the question of Palestine, but not really about. But we go beyond that. And I think now the major victims of today, what is going on, is genocide studies. I refer to the Sudanese scholar Abdul Wahab al-Afandi, who argues genocide studies was stuck by increasing polarization and partisanship, while many democratic countries simultaneously assuming the role of participant and deniers. And this constitutes definitely a very serious blow to the whole endeavor of genocide prevention. So I try to bring four factors why this liberal democratic countries, I mean, that adopt, I would say, a pro-genocidal Israeli position. And so I will take them one by one, about the memory of Holocaust, about Islamophobia, Israel as a secular state, and Euro-American colonial legacy. So the first one is, of course, I should make it clear that the Holocaust memory remain vivid, and the 7 October Hamas attack brought back some memories in a sincere manner. So I don't doubt this. However, the problem is more and more that anti-Semitism are weaponized, specifically by some interest group, particularly International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, who did a definition of anti-Semitism, which really it's problematic. It's particularly among 11 examples they brought to explain what is anti-Semitism, 7 are focused on Israel. So it become really conflating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, as well as criticism of Israeli action and policies, and particularly BDS. And it's a very interesting that in just 2 years later, many Israeli Jews and international Jewish scholar, they did another declaration to say it is unacceptable and it's a very dangerous. And they met in Jerusalem and they create Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism. My dear friend Navy Gordon, an Israeli British political scientist, showed the problem of syllogism fallacy. Anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews. To be Jews is to be Zionist. Therefore, anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic. So this is the I would say the false syllogism. And really, this I would say the Holocaust Remember Alliance is now more and more become the mainstream. In United States voted in favor of adopting it. In UK, the state, the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology asked even the president of institution of higher education and research to survey in its extremist views of social media, which include reference to genocide and apartheid. This is I quote here. And of course, I think the European Legal Support Center and the British Society of Middle East studies show that that this is extremely problematic, this adoption. If I come to particularly in Germany, I think trying to disinvite Ashila Membe 5 years ago because of his position on BDS, and Ghassan El-Haj and Nancy Fraser recently, I mean, I think there is a courageous a new scholarship, all coming from German academia, which is really give hope. Whether an Yunus talk like war on terror, war on anti-Semitism, which become really irrational, but also the work of Isra Uzerek, showing how the ministry, the German politicians, journalists, and academics subcontract guilt of the Holocaust to the new minority immigrant arrival, and also the work of Andrew Port in his book on Harvard University Press, examining the German response to the mass killing in Cambodia, Rwanda, and the Balkans. He suggests that the Holocaust may have unwittingly desensitized Germans, the conviction that they have left the rabid racism of their forebears far behind them may have paradoxically allowed for the unabashed expression of different forms of racism. And I think this is what we witness. And in Germany, we have this canceling of many events. But the funny cancellation was against Jewish Russian American writer Masha Gerson for Hannah Arendt Prize for political thought because of comparing Gaza before 7 October to the Jewish ghettos of Nazi occupied Europe. It's sufficiently funny because Hannah Arendt will not be eligible to get Hannah Arendt Prize today because she was critical of Israel. So let me go into the second factors, which really it's important, is how Israel portrayed as a secular state, and secular state cannot do something bad. I mean, this is when I was in Palestinian territories, I work a lot on the statistic on illegal settlement in occupied Palestinian territories, and I can guarantee, I don't have time to show you in details, that the left in Israel, Beres, for instance, was much more stealing land from Palestinian than the right wing. And just I remember a funny conversation with the late my professor and become a friend, Alan Turin, who told me when I contest, when he say, look, Israel, how she did miracle in 1993, bringing 120,000 Soviet Jews into Israel and observe them. So I told them, look, I mean, some of them they are in illegal settlement in OPT. And he told me, look, Sari, this is the chance of the life of the Palestinians. This secular people, they come from secular country, Soviet Union, he means, they will change everything. They will become pro-peace, and you will have a deal with them. Actually, I keep every 2-3 years when I see him, I told him, did you remember what you told me? And did you see where these people now? It's with for the far right wing. It's a really far right wing allied with the religious Jews. So I think this secularistic trend continue to flourish. And just last month, Eli Barnaby and Jill Kippel in the famous Express magazine, where they argue that there is a conflict today between two religious nationalist movements, Hamas and Islamic Jihad from the Palestinian side, and Israeli religious parties. As such, they cannot criticize Israel as a secular state, but the excess of some political fringe of this country. Of course, Jill Kippel went much farther, analogizing Hamas to Al-Qaeda and ISIS and compare 7 October to 9/11. Even he wrote a book called Holocausts with S to say now the Holocaust is again the West waged by the Islamic terrorism. So this is lead me to the Islamophobia, and to say really now, and here, if you like, I will engage with the talk of Goran, that now Islamophobia in countries like Europe or Euro America is really which make the convergence between the left and the right, and more the left, which the right wing, the far right wing, which historically and anti-Semitic, they become so pro-Israelis or colonial settler logic of Israel, simply because the enemy of their enemy is their friend. So and the left, of course, they have a complacent position about Islamophobia for different reasons. I don't have time to develop it. But it's a very interesting when you look to the French media, where I observe it very well for my research, to tell you that first of all, in German and French media, you don't find rarely a Palestinian or Muslim voices. It's always a kind of a white people talking. So in the French media, a slippery slope when talking about Islam is very interesting. They bring people to talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, those who work on the Islamist movement, and not so they don't recognize Hamas has a nationalistic, national liberation ideology as well. So a slippery slope when talking about Islam. What is debated is not Islam as a phenomenon and as an object of investigation, but Islam as a filter and a criterion for demarking belonging to the political community. My last factors, and I will stop here, is Euro-American colonial legacy. And I think this is, as you see, I put it in the end to say, I don't like when we explain everything by post-colonialism. But I think really here, I see how it's playing role. Those who are far right wing, who under Islamophobia defend very pro-Israeli colonial practice, but also those who claim to be of a critical theory from symbolic liberals, they really converge. And here I cannot help but to mention Jürgen Habermas. I mean, his statement that he signed it with the Center for Ethics and Order in Germany is for me outrageous. And really, I mean, I don't recognize from Frankfurt School anyone a little bit except Marcuse who really think about the third world. I mean, all their reflection is a Eurocentric, and they don't see us. They see us just nothing really. I met Jürgen Habermas in Jerusalem during the Second Intifada in 2001, and I wanted to invite him to Ramallah to give a talk, but I was outraged that he didn't want to denounce something was so obvious in 2001, how Israel is moving to apartheid and a settler colonial state, at least in West Bank and Gaza, and he was reluctant to do it. So, again, I see sometimes the colonial method. Wait for the people to die, make a museum of their genocide, then set up Department of Decoloniality over their mass grave. This is how Afrin Faridi, an Iranian scholar, wrote once. I will finish with 2 points. I think now we are really, and this is my conclusion. I am so alarmed about the crisis of liberal democracy today. Alarm simply because I'm afraid that the other alternative, whether Russian or Chinese or I don't know, or Bashar al-Assad, or is terrible. So I'm keen to the democracy and to redress the past. So I think we need a common language. So there is a pertinent of universal category, but in the same time, there is a gap between liberal values and their application specifically outside of the confine of the nation state. So, so pertinence of universal categories. So if I quote Hamid Debashi, those of us outside of the European sphere of moral imagination don't exist in their philosophical universe. Arab, Iranians, and Muslim, we don't have any ontological reality for European philosopher except as a metaphysical menace that must be conquered and quitted. For me, each thought has its own blind spot. This is how, I mean, I am keen to say we need the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But in the same time, and we need concept like social classes. We forge in sociology is a very important concept of some concept, if you like, that it's had an abstract way a universal meaning, but then when you put it concretely, you find the blind spot. So not only social science and humanity influence culture, but culture also influence knowledge production. Yet humanistic value and universal categories are salient for comparing social phenomena and mobilizing humanistic solidarity. This is me as a Palestinian always dreaming how the Brazilian and Lula will support us. This is because of this, if you like, we have a common language between Brazilian and us. But then my last point is, are liberal values applicable outside of the nation state or European space? I would say historically and thinking of colonialism, not at all. And as I mentioned, Habermas. So how to deal with somebody like Habermas? I mean, should we throw his thought because of his Eurocentrism and disregard us? And here, if you like, where I problematize, my critique to the cancel culture, that we need to be very careful. Here, I would distinguish between thought connected to the position taken and those who are not directly connected. So I will not throw his communicational theory, communicational act theory, even if he is blind about us. The same thing about Foucault and his soft position about pedophilia is the same about Levinas and his not criticizing Israel, about even celebrities, about the king of Belgium, whether we should throw the statue or not. I think it's better to remove his statue from Brussels, is to write, to educate public that he was maybe hero in Belgium, but he was absolutely a genocidal figure for Congo and for Rwanda. So things like that. So this is, if you like, where I resolve this problem, because look, why? Because I live in a country, in Lebanon, where I see my students seeing the position of the politicians and even some scholars in the West. They want to say there is no universal human rights. There is no, all are lies. So I said no. We need today. We need to disentangle the. We need to disentangle the referentiality of this Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the West. Now, those who are custodian of this declaration is South Africa, who is so sensitive against genocide and apartheid. It's Chile, which is so sensitive against Israeli colonial fact. So today, by this entanglement between the West and this humanistic value, we can save them. Otherwise, we are really in trouble. I don't want my radical Islamist and radical left here, I mean, throw the baby with the bathwater. let me stop here.
Very good. Well, you wrote to the end a very important, bringing in many questions that really concern us all. We can synthesize, I know, because we have been discussing this for a long time. In the end, the problem is the future of democracy and the future of humanity even. So this is what is at the stake here. No? Apart from academic freedom, all of that is part of the basis of what is the future of democracy. As we understand it, I will call substantive democracy, because it's clear that when we talk about democracy, we're talking about institutions that fail us, individuals that fail us, as you mentioned, several of them. Anyway, we can come back to that, but I would like to see if there are any questions from our colleagues first, and we go on.
Maybe if somebody remove the PowerPoint, that we see each other better. Yeah.
Pablo Enrique.
Well, thank you. Sorry, I'm very happy to can see you talking for us, because you are very brave. I like it. I'm going to make an academic provocation to allow you to broaden your reflection on this conference. I think you have competently expanded the current meanings of colonialism. You are very brave. Then I would like to question you about the complex connection between new technologies and decolonization of the thinking in favor of democracy. One example, Bill Gates recently gave an interview suggesting that artificial intelligence will rapidly change the context of learning in school in the coming months. He spoke with great optimism. Then, how do you see the impact of artificial intelligence on the educational process and the formation of citizenship? Will it aggravate the social pathology created by the logic of egoism in modernity, or can it offer more alternatives to decolonize general injustice, emancipating humanism in favor of democratization process?
Thank you so much, Paulo. Look, I mean, I think, as you know, Paulo, really, I have one item on my agenda as a president of the International Sociological Association is to connect sociology to moral philosophy, and I think more and more things are disconnected, and this is, if you like, where I argue that that in fact. Let me do a little bit of digression, and I will come to you. The digression, if you like, my criticism to symbolic liberals of if you like, the left become cultural left, forgetting the real issue of social justice and hiding behind identity politics and things like that. And I think, Eric, the enjoyment, if you like, that this impossible enjoyment to talk like Eric. I mean, how to overcome this? I argue that our social science forgot the mission of it. It has the commitment to civil society have two levels, and they forgot the level one. Level one is to provide knowledge for civil society to dialogue its French with each other. For instance, I come from area where the left, they don't want to talk with the religious people, saying religious people are, by definition, they are fascists, they are etc. And actually, it's not true. I mean, for the first time in the Arab world, a religious party, they claim secularism. Of course, they don't claim it a la Francaise. So what I wanted to say, there is a level of mediation. What I call it soft normativity. It means that really we should not impose our normativity on people. we will provide knowledge for if you like, for this public reason and social movements. However, the second level, where we have a strong normativity, that really we are in favor of the progress with the marginalized, we are socialists, we are for cooperation, we are for even if you like, a classless society. So this is the strong normativity. This is where this is why I call, we need the dialogical sociology. So if you like, now I will come to you, Paulo. I think the problem today that less and less we talk to each other in order to really to alleviate the fear, the mistrust of the population about specific issues, and before giving us our normativity and what our conception of the good life. And that, so if you like, this is something really very important. This is what I mean by connecting sociology to moral philosophy. Moral philosophy is about the process, about justification, is much more than about the outcome. The outcome is where you have a position of progressivism, etc. So I will close this parenthesis and going to your yes, we have a huge problem. When Bill Gates talk about AI, first they didn't acknowledge that in many countries, they still, the access to the internet is really is very related to social class. So AI will increase, will polarize more society. Well, in Lebanon, you have areas where you don't have internet. You have internet, of course, but what internet for WhatsApp and not for not for engaging with AI. So the Bill Gates, it's again another neoliberal reflection, a neoliberal view of the world, where everything can be resolved by technology without this moral, ethical deliberation. This is, if you like, the connection with the first part. So yes, we need the decolonization, absolutely, of this knowledge. So, yeah.
Okay, Eric.
Hi, thank you very much. It was fantastic. I have two questions, comments. The first one is this assumption that universities or other academic institutions should be or spaces for nurturing academic freedom. I think that has never been the case, other than in very rare periods of time. Universities, academic institutions worldwide and historically have always been the spokes configuration of power. The only brief moments that universities or academic institutions function as spaces for nurturing free speech is after moments of intense struggle over occupying academia. That's what happened in the 1960s and the 1970s. The short period of time that universities and academic centers began to function as havens for academic free speech. Most of the time, both geographically and historically, they were not. They have never been. Why should we assume that universities and academic institutions are cradles for free speech? They've never been, unless you fight for that. And that can be occasionally successful. So that's number one. I'm questioning the assumption that universities and academic institutions are cradles of free speech. I don't think that's ever been the case, except for very rare moments. The second comment is about cancel culture and everything that is associated with it. And I very much agree with you that the right, the populist right, has very effectively mobilized the politics of canceling and cancel culture. But let's not forget that a very theoretical intellectual origin of cancel culture comes from the liberal left. So we should not blame some spurious external power, whether it's European thought or capitalism or modernity or neoliberalization, for inflicting cancel culture on us. It is the liberal left itself that was the very cradle, the intellectual basis for making this condition of canceling, articulated precisely around nurturing identity politics as a assumedly more radical perspective than the old sort of modernist universalism. So is it not the case that it is us, not all of us, but us liberal intellectuals that have been the very co-architect of the condition that we are now suffering from?
Eric, thank you so much. Actually, I fully agree with the 2 points. The first point, I am a little bit need more historicizing, because I do remember in a walk with the Giorgio Agamben in Polonia, he was we were discussing his state of exception I mean, as a paradigmatic methodology to see the world, and he looked to and he was always talking in a negative way. And then we were walking in to go to the university, and he told me, do you see this this university, the first university in Europe, is intramuros, actually to protect itself from the clerics of the church. So if you like, historically you have a moment where for instance, Humboldtian movement is really interesting as Humboldtian University is really championing this this autonomy. Napoleonian one is a very interesting. It's championing autonomy, not vis-a-vis the state, but vis-a-vis the society, if you like. So again, we have a models, but I fully agree. I mean, every examples I brought is, I mean, with the beautiful examples of the university, is the 60s and 70s. About the second culture, I will, once we finish this, I will send you my article where precisely I'm talking about that. But if you like, as somebody who come from the left, and I don't, and people, I mean, can easily smash my idea by saying you play on the hand of the right. I said no. I am saying culture as a culture. You find it among the right, but in fact, the proportionally in any case, statistically, is much more from the liberal left than from the right. And I think this is what my work now is really about. How like Olivier Roy work about l'aplatissement du monde, flattening the world by deculturalizing norms, and the deculture. I mean, where you remove the culture as a common share codes and replace it by identity politics. And here we come LGBTQ as a category, X, Y, Z. It become very divisive and participate into this polarization. So fully agree with your comment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sadi. And Eric, I guess that Goran will have some comment, or I will say something later. Goran?
Well, I've noticed. I mean, as a retired academic, I mean, I'm very glad I'm out of this mess of identity politics, right and left, and so on, and cancel culture. And I think it's important. I mean, to although that's not very easy, but it's important to maintain an ethical scholarship and of the academia as the focus of debate. This is right. I mean that, as he said, it has never been much of total academic freedom, but it's been more or less. And I also agree with sorry, I mean, there have been rather negative and destructive tendencies on sectors of the left, particularly, I mean, the identitarian of cultivating an ultra sensitivity, I mean, to words and expressions and an unrestrained will to silence others. I mean, who they feel are injuring them and so on. And that's a common problem, you know, of right and left in a certain sense. So, and I'm afraid, I mean, that the left, you know, the 1960s, of which I was, of course, a part, opened up the carapace of academia, the plurality of views, and that also meant, I mean, a plurality of, or a polarization of views. There were many more theories, arguments around. They differed much more widely than they did in the 1950s. And I remember from that time, there were some of us who did try to, who was teachers, I mean, took a particular pride in showing respect to right-wing students who questioned us, and and we also tried to argue, I mean, that any opinion, I mean, is permissible, but in scholarship, there is evidence is deciding, is the gavel deciding, and we were helped at that time by prevailing epistemologies and with a culture of science, which was destroyed, I think, in the postmodernist era, and which has contributed very much, I mean, to this current nature of academia and identity politics. And I have no solution for this other than just pointing to, I mean, that somebody has to take a stand for scholarship and for limit for limitless opinion space, at any kind of opinion, but it cannot be taken as scholarship in science unless it's based on scientific criteria. To some of you who are very young, the current generations, this might sound a bit old-fashioned, but I guess it is. But I don't think anybody is very happy. I mean, with the current situation, neither the right nor the left. I mean, it's a self-destructive behavior, and which is then exploited. I mean, by external powers stepping in, as they, U.S. governors, state governors often do, or donors do, which is not a problem of the North in general, sorry, but of mainly, I mean, of the United States and some other places. But in Germany, they have the intervention of the education culture minister of the land, the state of, I don't know. So this is oh no, let me say one more. I share sorry, alarm about, I mean, the situation at many universities in the world, the problematicness which the issue of academic freedom has happened into. But I don't think we should put that at the forefront as a problem of democracy. Above all, I mean, for all its elegance and eloquence, academia is a very small part of society and of the power structure, and is the macro of democracy we shouldn't lose sight of. And in the North, for instance, I mean, the current effect of the rapidly rising militarization of northern society and the turn of the European Union, I mean, from a peace organization, earning the peace Nobel Prize, to becoming a war economy and a war society, and the extraordinary indifference to human suffering, which the Western political elite has shown in recent months. I think these are sort of the most serious problem. But it's easier for me who is outside current academia to say that for you who are living in it.
Eric,
Yes, to come back to the bigger question, democratization. I mean, I very much agree with what Göring's diagnosis was. That is, on the one hand, that actually existing liberal democracy is increasingly moving towards right-wing populism. Your notion of genocidal democracy captures that very well. So actually existing liberal democracy in its instituted form is veering increasingly towards a de-democratizing configuration, with very little hope on the horizon. On the other hand, as you also rightly pointed out, there are quite interesting and potentially powerful democratizing movements. You mentioned the Arab Spring, the Indignados, Occupy, the Umbrella Movement. There are endless series of forms of political mobilization that stands for democratic emancipation, but they systematically fail. So you seem to be caught on the one hand, with the de-democratization of actually existing democratic institutions, with very little hope for internal transformation towards great democratization. And on the one hand, quite vocal series of democratizing movements, but which turn out to be totally impotent in actually changing the democratic institutional form. So we're all a bit stuck here, in this kind of deadlock of institutions that democratize and a politicizing civil society, which is completely ineffective, despite the success hopes we have. The Arab movement, Chile, Indignados, Occupy, you name it, but it's utterly impotent in even slightly changing the actual existing institutional configurations. So don't see much hope, so to speak. Yes, I agree with Esteban's notion that there is always an other world possible. But at the moment, I have given up hope in seeing the possibilities of actually moving slightly in that direction. And I was wondering if anyone had a view on this kind of stalemate, this kind of deadlock situation with deteriorating democratic configurations in a context in which there are actually quite a lot of people actively fighting, but not very effectively or performatively so.
Yeah. I would like to say something briefly.
Yeah.
Mainly to provoke the others as well. Sari did something that is adding to the discussion, which is a bit of the north-south, which in a sense, north-south between double marks, confrontations or differences or gaps, whatever. I think this is important because without falling into the question of identity politics, etc., that Paulo brought earlier, I think that it's important to notice some movements that sometimes we do not conceptualize like democratic movements or with capacity to democratize. I think that Latin America, in that sense, I think Africa as well and Asia, but in Latin America is very clear. Precisely the Chilean case that Eric mentioned, I am aware of the case, and yes, it is a substantial advance in many ways, yet there is a problem because the left in government continues to do the same with the indigenous people. For instance, there is no change. Therefore, in Latin America, we have now two cases to mention, Colombia and Brazil. Colombia first, when the first woman from Afro-American origin was elected vice president of the country, Francia Márquez, She's a militant of human rights, is a lawyer, comes from a very poor community, is a fighter for water rights as well in her community, but is a lawyer and is a leader. This is a good example of someone who comes to power. In the case of Brazil, President Lula, now in this government, created the Ministry of Indigenous People. The first time that a ministry of indigenous people in the country, and probably in Latin America, probably. And an indigenous person is the minister. It will not change in practice very much, and the minister already said that. She already was fighting with Lula from the beginning. But there are changes, and this is systematic because we know in Latin America from the research done by the UN Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean that the main obstacle here are precisely indigenous communities and Afro communities. And there is an emergence of indigenous and Afro-American movements that have been going on for decades in reality. But now it's coming through even countries like Argentina that belong to what Crosby called the New Europes, sometime. Has an Afro-American Argentinian movement, which for me is amazing, because it's not clear where are these people in Argentina, for instance, or in Uruguay, white countries between double marks. I think this question will not solve, it's not an answer to Eric's question, because I don't believe that there is some romanticism that we can have about that. Not at all, not at all. But I mean that the forces that no one controls, but when you see, if you made the question, how we identify where the possibilities, I think we have to identify where the problem is and where the struggle is, where is the conflict. I think the struggle is the window to identify where the future might come in some way. And I am just mentioning one or two windows that I can see here, because the same thing that Sari said before about the Arab world, or the Arab-Iranian world, or the Arab-Egyptian world, there are several worlds there as well, how the West looks at these people as non-existent. And the same happens in Latin America and Africa, of course. But I think this is an opportunity as well, because of course people are taking power. It may not go in the direction that we want, for sure, I am sure of that. We may end up saying, well, we didn't want this. No, of course. And it may happen. It may happen. So, but I just wanted to provoke a bit more with this comment.
Goran has a short comment.
Yes, I would like to add to that with the last speaker, with whom I fully agree. I would like
Goran,
to add that
can you
have
put the Goran,
already
Goran, can you
that
put the microphone closer to your mouth?
all over the world, and particularly in the global south, the people of the 21st century are much less subordinate, are much less subordinate than previous generation. And actually, the first 2 decades of the 21st century saw a historical record of anti-government demonstrations and protests. They were of all kinds, and some of them in right liberal direction, others in left direction. But anyway, the important point was that those first 2 decades saw the largest social movements of protest in modern history. Actually, we have some several studies of that corroborate. So in that sense, I mean, there is a hope in this century. I mean, the institutions are declining, decaying, and in the global north, I mean, there isn't the night will just get darker, yes. But in many parts of the global south, there is an enormous potential of popular forces demanding various aspects of social justice, of democracy, and of emancipation. And that's something we cannot foresee, cannot predict when and where this will erupt and with what results. In essence, we are like volcanologists. I mean, we know that the volcano will erupt in not too distant future, but when and where, I mean, we don't know exactly, and how it will end. I mean, that's another question we don't know. So in this, I don't want to continue to any despondency here. I mean, there's still rational reasons to keep up the fighting spirit for democracy.
Can I say a word here?
Yeah. Sorry. Go on. Yes, of course.
Yeah, I love the last words Goran said. I mean, differentiation between where a country with a heavy institutionalization, which make the things are very difficult to change, and other more communitarian setting, if you like. And I think today, the major issue at stake. Is it the noise from me? No? Okay. And the major issue at stake today, how our liberal democracy, we balance between individual and community. And I think the more the community can create a space of salvation that really undermine this state hegemony, this neoliberal centralized logic centralized logic. Here, for instance, I should mention the work of Paolo Martin, Silvia Cataldi, and Gennaro Oiros with the concept of social love, if you like, and convivialism. Look, it's not it's not a kind of a rosy way of seeing the world, not at all. It's not Habermasian a way of saying that we resolve our problem by public reason and rationality. It's not like that. It's really to see today, and here to reply to Eric. Actually, all the subtlety of sociology, I think, is to see where is when the entry point to break the system. To break is not, if not the system, to break a specific area in the system where other actors, alternative actors, come and they create their own space. So this is for me is really important. I've been in the last 7 years, 7 months in many capitals where I attended demonstration against the genocide on Gaza. What really is fascinates me, how this convergence between ecologic movement and national liberation movement, how they more and more they talk to each other with the feminist movement, and so on. So if you like, I think there is a way of seeing how bottom up a solidarity can emerge, resisting all this mighty system that we see and that it's cannot change. But actually, we can change in a communitarian level, in a microcosm level, and things like that. And I think social love of as a theory is a methodology, is enable us to see this microcosm, this spaces where we can really intervene and push it. But otherwise, I agree with Goran, with Eric, with Esteban, that really the situation is more and more bleak, and I and also I like what Goran said, that in fact the fighting between the left and right end up by destroying each other. And creating more radical fringe and creating and benefiting the military industrial complex and and some forces really that they are not very interested about all these issues that the identity politics, that whether the left is waging it or the right. So it's just I wanted to make this few comments.
Thank you, Sari. Eric?
Yeah. What strikes me, or what I think is an extraordinary challenge for the intellectual left concerned with questions of emancipation and democratization, is to revisit the 19th and 20th century and to consider what does not any longer work in the 21st century. So if we think of emancipation and democratization in the 19th and 20th century, certainly in the global north, it always hinged around three axes. Who is the subject of change, right? And the classic answer in the 19th and 20th century was the working class, and in the 20th added with the feminist movement. So the workers, feminists, these were the subjects of democratization. And particularly the proletarian as an emancipatory subject emerged out of a theorization of his or her social positionality. Secondly, what is the adequate form of organization? And the answer in the 19th, 20th century was the party, the Social Democratic or the Communist or the Socialist Party, as the organizational vehicle to gain the political power to move towards emancipation. And the third axis, what to occupy, was the state. Right? So it was the proletarian with the feminist in a party structure to occupy the state. This is where the dominant liberal democratic configuration still is. I don't think it works anymore in the 20th century. So if we really want to think seriously the possibility of emancipation in the 20th century, we have to revisit these three axes. Who is the subject of change? Who is the emancipated subject? I have no idea. So I can speculate, and then all sorts of arguments. The indigenous people, the Afro-Americans, women, queers. I don't know. No, who is the subject of change? Two, what is the appropriate organizational form? Because the party form is not any longer functioning. And I agree with what Gerland said. Over the past 2 decades, we've seen extraordinary social mobilization, totally ineffective in making even small changes in the existing order, which had to do with a very weak form of organization. And thirdly, occupying the state is pointless. The history here in Europe of Greece is very telling. In 2015, 2016, many of us on the left in Europe put a lot of hope in that for the first time in Greece, a left government was voted in. It was a total failure. It did not work. So we do know that occupying the state is not any longer the kind of terrain, the scale or the geographical configuration to occupy. So the question, what do we fight over? How do we organize, and who the hell is going to do it? And I think the answers to these three questions are for me extremely important. I don't have an easy answer, but certainly questions or it invites us to revisit what were the key axes of emancipatory transformation in the 19th and 20th century. And I doubt whether they're still or performative in the 21st century.
Many thanks, Eric. Well, I think that, yeah, Sari?
No, to make a little bit of a provocation, to say, for instance, in the Arab Spring, for me, there is a political failure, but not a cognitive failure. Cognitively, discursively, for instance, you create a consensus about secularism, but secularism not a la Française, not in a sense of a separation, total separation between the state and religion, or politics and religion, or neutrality of the state, or it's not in terms of separation, but distinction and respecting. To talk like the Indian scholar, the principal distance between religion and the state, religion and politics. If you like, the major actors of this is the Islamist movement. I mean, those who changed, and I think this is really a positive thing. I mean, I wrote recently a paper. I did content analysis of the debate since the Arab uprisings, and we see how debate started by only the left saying how important the secularism, and we end up now it is a mainstream language for the Islamist, for if you like, the religious and non-religious. So I see sometimes I see sometimes interesting that discursively is the right wing, for instance, here on terms of secularism, where they make the progress. And so this is why I go back to say, look, we need to listen to each other to see where is the progress happened and how to maximize on it. But I like so much, Eric, your methodology to see these three things in order to see in each context how actors, social actors, can move or cannot move the situation.
Thanks, Ari. Well, I think that there are quite a few topics here. And I think what we got first is very good topics for a continuation of this discussion, is one thing I want to say. There are several things. There are issues that have been mentioned by Sari and others now that I think are very important. What Eric said probably has no answer right now. Who is the subject? You say, probably I don't have the answer, and we don't have the answer. There are many subjects. There are many subjects, potential subjects.
But we do
problematic.
see,
Yeah.
sociologically speaking, if we look at the extraordinary social and political movements that have sprung up over the past 2 decades, they are very heterogeneous. Yeah, men and women, intellectuals and workers, religious, non-religious, white and non-white, etc. So the kind of mobilizations that tend towards an emancipatory, democratizing direction cannot be situated, I would argue, within a particular social identification. You know, what those heterogeneous, I mean, one that I've looked at very carefully was the Taksim movement in Istanbul, in Turkey, 2014. Now, 500,000 people of all walks of life. So we may want to revisit the classic sort of Marxist interpretation that your social position defines what your political conviction, strategy, and desire will be all about. Now, so you have a heterogeneous social composition that nonetheless comes together around a demand for equality, emancipation, and democratization. But these are very, very empty signifiers. They don't mean much. So what is totally absent? So I agree with what Sadi said. Of course, we do see this extraordinary confluence of um, the anti-Israeli genocide movement, the climate movement, etc. And I see that happening too in the streets, the kind of joining up of these forces, which is very promising. But to achieve what? You know, they have no name for their desire. Well, in other words, what they are expressing is what Adorno would call a negative dialectic. It's very clear what they do not want. Yeah, it's very clear what they are against, which is fine. That's the first step, of course. But there's utterly an almost complete absence of a symbolization in political terms of the desire. What is the political name for a more emancipatory, democratically inclusive, socially sensible, environmentally sustainable society? What's the name for that? Now, I would argue that there are only two possible names for that, which is socialism or communism. But these political signifiers are completely banned. Yeah? And as the result of that, one does not have a positive embodiment of the desire in a political name. We only have the sort of negative dialectics. I mean, against Israel, against climate change, against racism, against populism, etc. But these do not point at the transformation. It does not give an imaginary as to what we do want, politically speaking. So there is no political name for our desire. You say we want a more environmentally sensible, socially inclusive, politically equal society. What do you call that, politically speaking? You know, there's total silence about that. And I think that's a serious problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, I think this is a very good point. I was going to say, bringing in the question of nature society, I think this is an important topic to open up the debate at the future, because, of course, this is a most important point, because Ian Cook, an Australian political scientist, just wrote a book saying the last 100 years of humanity. He claims that 2030 to 2130 will be the 100 years that will characterize the demise of humanity. And the main argument is obviously climate change and global warming, etc. So probably it's too apocalyptic. Noam Chomsky has done that. In another word, he says something like internationalization or disappearance. Exactly. He says that in one of the books. His recent book. Maybe too apocalyptic. But
I mean, the whole of the environmental and climate debate is structured by the narrative that humanity has to be saved. If we continue what we're doing, we will see the end of humanity. Now, this is an extraordinary fantasy, because the very condition of climate change, or what is happening in Israel and Gaza, is an indication of the absence of humanity. There is no humanity. There's not one that I can see other than in small pockets of communitarian care. Yes, of course, there are pockets of great and fantastic humanity, but on a world scale, there is no humanity. In fact, it's precisely the absence of humanity that causes the problem to begin with. So there's nothing to be saved because it doesn't exist. Our only hope is to produce a humanity. So this continuous invocation of a humanity is an extraordinary but extremely potent fantasy to indicate something that is not there. Our only hope to survive as humans is to produce a humanity. Otherwise the catastrophe will happen. That's the old Marxist dictum: catastrophe, barbarism, or socialism. Socialism understood as the construction of a humanity. Anyway, that's why there's no hope with the climate movement and environmental movement, because they want to save something that does not exist. In order to deal with climate change, they have to change the inhumanity of the world, which produces the environmental catastrophe, as we see at a local scale in Gaza and at a global scale with climate change. Anyway, I keep on ranting here. I'll stop.
very good. Thank you very much. Well, I don't know, Alex, if there are any questions from public. This is for Sari.
Yeah, it's a compliment, much more. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Okay, I think, well, we can wait now. We can keep talking a little bit. We have time, but to close while we see if there are any other questions or comments. I think that in some way, this first session of the series of seminars has brought quite a few issues that we can consider for future events, no? Even for publications that we thought could emerge from this meeting. We can talk about that later, but there are quite a few good points. I think that we are talking about very complex things. We are here already a complex group. We have people from the north, from the south, from the east, or the east is a south as well in some ways. This is a very complex situation in many ways. So all our questions, who is the subject, we have very different answers in Lebanon, obviously, in the north, here in Latin America, in Africa. See, this is a problem. We don't have a common language, and probably will not have a common language in the sense of unifying our desire, as you will put it. This is not an obstacle. Well, it is an obstacle, but it's not unsurmountable. It is an obstacle that we can challenge and try to surpass. And this is our contributing to a new humanity, or to a humanity it never existed, perhaps, in a sense, is a task, or the task. That's something that can we say is emerging from this seminar. No, it's not new, but we are consolidating that idea. That's the point. So I think this is something that... And then the question of the topic of the seminar, democratization and authoritarianism. Very clear here, we consolidated the notion that they are not opposing sides. They are together. Democracy and authoritarianism are part of the same problem, or of the same good. They are together. They have always been like that. So, as Goran cited the Trilateral Commission report, democracy was a danger to itself. So that's the notion that if you really allow democracy to thrive, it will have a problem, democracy. If you allow democracy to be democratic, that's a problem. Of course, for some people, for some positions. But this more or less describes what we are living. In Latin America, for instance, we had governments that expanded rights, and that was a problem for democracy understood by the colonizers that are back now. We have a moment of neocolonialism and neo-imperialism right now. And they don't like democracy at all. They want us to be democratic, let's say, formally, but in practice, you will be an enemy if you are democratic, truly democratic, if you believe you can be democratic. So this is one of the points that emerges from here. Eric wanted to say something? No? Okay. But I think that for plans for the future, for future series of seminars, the idea of doing some comparative debates, I think is very important, because after all, in each of our countries or regions, we end up having circulated some ideas. We can't escape the local or the regional. This is a good thing about this seminar. We have escaped the regional and the local in some ways that are important. Otherwise, we sometimes tend to believe that actually we have a terrible problem that no one else has. No, it's not true. We can see what happens in Europe right now, and obviously we don't want to be there right now in some ways. No? So, but future collaborations that are comparative, bringing out key topics, and I think we have 2 or 3 key topics here, will be an important way to move forward and contribute. Thinking about our students, Sarito say something about the students in Lebanon. And we can say something about our own students here in Latin America, even here in this university, how to move them to pay attention to this. How can we attract them to learn about this? Because the apathy is enormous. There is apathy, not only among students, even among academics. We can see that in Latin America. Topics have been brought to... I remember being in Mexico in the 1990s, and I see the damage caused to the institutions there. Today we have a language that was implemented in the 1990s, and is still there. I remember once saying something that Eric said before. We wanted to say the students in Mexico in 1992 wanted to attend a seminar on socialism in the 21st century. The director of the program say, no, we are not allowing you to go to discuss things that were dead already in the 1970s. That kind of idea is still alive in Latin America. It's still alive in the universities. In the universities. And if it is not there, they are trying to kill it. So how can we revive this debate to make students and others, not only students, attracted to this necessary discussion? No? Not to just communicate one type of thinking. Here there have been several types of thinking, converging but different. And I think this type of well understood pluralism, not a badly understood pluralism, but this is a pluralism of open thinking, bringing out topics from different experiences around the world, is fundamental. And this is somehow what we want to do with this series of seminars, to stimulate thinking and provoke, because at the end, the young people are the ones that may do that, what we are thinking now, that we cannot. Probably they will be the ones that will do it, but we have to help them to find a way. That's a question. No? Anyway. Well, Pablo Enrique, want to say something for, no? Okay. Okay, well, I think we came to an end. It was a good end. I am quite happy with the seminar, with your participation, your contributions, and we will keep moving on with this for future events. And of course, we welcome any suggestion from you. Sally sent some suggestion. I have to apologize to women because we wanted to have women here, not just men. But I have to say, personally, I couldn't achieve that. But we have several promises. At least we had women that promised it. And I trust women promises. So we will have women in the future in our seminar. So we had an Egyptian who is based in the US, several that you mentioned, Sari, some colleagues from Union University and from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So they say they may participate in the future. Hopefully we will. So let's look forward for that. Anyway, well, thank you very much. And if there are no more questions, we can close this one. It will be available in YouTube, so we will send the link later on. And thank you very much in the name of the university. Thank you, Sari.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. So pleasure to see you all. Ciao. Bye-bye.
Yes,
Bye.
ciao,
Ciao.